Oh, I'm live. Hello, everyone, on the Ask Me Anything about the Michael Parkinson podcast and, the Virtually Parky podcast and also the YouTube. It's very good, well, not to see you, but hopefully to hear some of your questions. In fact, I have some questions, which I will start with. Some very interesting ones here, actually, and quite difficult. So yeah, you must be some quite difficult poses, but that's good. I'm going to start with Michael Byrne from YouTube, who asks a very direct question, which is, what do you think your dad would have made of the podcast? Michael, if you were here, I'd like to ask you what you would think my dad would make of the podcast. But I think my dad would have been, at first, probably slightly suspicious of it and wondered exactly what it would have meant. But I think he trusted me enough, given our relationship, that anything that I thought was worth doing, that he would have supported. I have to say, he would not have understood the technology at all. My father had the ability, if he looked at a piece of technology, it collapsed. So he wasn't that in that way. But I think what's interesting about my father is that people don't remember or don't realize quite how much of a trailblazer he was in his past. And I think that kind of goes to the root of why I think this is a perfect legacy product for him. When he was a young man, he worked for a company called Granada, and they were in the northwest of in Manchester. And they were an absolutely pioneering television company. They really did kick over the trestles of British establishment, British class system. My father was right at the center of that because he was part of that cultural revolution that transported kids, young men and women from working class backgrounds, right into the forefront and into the middle of the British establishment. And he was there alongside them. And then when he went to the BBC, people forget that the Parkinson show is become established as almost television royalty. But the reality is the Parkinson show was a incredibly groundbreaking and very risky product because it wasn't what he was asked to do. He was asked to do a show which is effectively a music variety show. And him and his producer decided to go and do a journalistic-based, conversational-based talk show against all the wishes, again, of the BBC. And he took a real punt, and it worked out. And I think he kind of would have got behind this project in that same vein. And also, I think in many ways, he would have been okay with it because I think he did trust me to make sure that anything I did with his legacy would have been properly done, properly produced, and properly thought about. The next question is from Chris Hainstock 330 on YouTube, and actually, it's about the podcast. It says, out of interest, why make the participants wear headphones? Is it to make them concentrate harder, or a technical reason? Well, it's actually quite a boring reason, really. Actually, Chris, unfortunately, it's because if we didn't have headphones, we would have to play the voice of the AI Parky into the actual studio. And that would be quite distracting and it would make the recording quite difficult. So why they wear headphones is because it means that AI Parky is played directly into their headphones. They can listen to the question. And also it means as well, if something happens or we need to contact them from the actual control room because we're not actually in the recording place with them, we can talk to them directly as well. Also, what's very interesting is that the process of AI Parky is because this AI is not it's a text-based model. So what it does is how it listens is it basically transcribes everything you say to it. And so if you answer very long, like I would answer very long, it would take about 4.5 hours to transcribe my answers, but it transcribes everything. And so when the person speaks and delivers their answer, there is a delay. When the AI Parky transcribes what they've just said, he then thinks about it and then posits a question based upon what they've said, or indeed what it knows about from the information that we've given it. So that's kind of why we have headphones on as well. So got one here from Kevin Echoes YouTube. If you had to interview anyone in the world, who would you choose? I think if you mean you, I think probably we're talking about possibly AI Parky, the podcast. I honestly would like, and it wouldn't be someone that my father would have liked to interview, but I would love to get on one of those big tech billionaires purely and simply because I'd like to say, well, here you go. Here's your brave new world. How do you feel about it? How do you feel you should interact with it? It's all very well sitting in your ivory towers and promising us trips to Mars and promising us the golden century of AI taking all the nasty jobs we don't want to do. But this is the sharp end. This is the interface between an AI and you. And I wonder how you feel about it, because you're so insistent that we should get used to living with AI. How do you like to live with AI? And also what would be quite nice as well is they could turn around and say, well, actually, we could help you improve it this way, or possibly give us a bit more money to make it even better than it already is. So that's who I'd like to interview. Got one here from Patrick Clan on TikTok. I honestly can't believe that my father's name is associated with a TikTok account. That is fantastic. I have achieved all I want to do in my life now that my father's on TikTok. My father did not even know. I told you before, he couldn't even send a text. Never mind have an account on TikTok. That's amazing. So how much did your father want to interview Frank Sinatra? It was his life's ambition. It was his greatest regret that he never got to interview Frank Sinatra. And that is the truth. He would have given anything to interview Frank Sinatra. The reason he didn't was because Sinatra never gave interviews. Sinatra didn't need to give interviews because Sinatra was the biggest star in the world. Sinatra could announce a concert and it was sold out within half an hour. And also because Frank had many areas of his life that he didn't really want to talk about. He didn't want to talk about his association with the mob, which was, it's the worst kept secret. And therefore he was a man who's quite private about that. Now, my father got very close. He thought he was going to book Frank Sinatra. He thought he had him. He had a friend called Sammy Khan, who was a composer. And Sammy was the person who wrote quite a lot of Frank's well-remembered hits. He's an important composer for Frank, so he was very close to him. My father went over to LA. He was one of the times I think he was over there to cover the Muhammad Ali fight with Joe Frazier. And Sammy said, come to a party. Frank will be there, Frank, and I'm going to introduce him to you. And I guarantee you, Michael, if I introduce you, he will be on your show. So he went to this party and he went in the door and it was literally like Hollywood Walk of Fame in there. He couldn't actually believe it. I mean, it was extraordinary. Every person in the room had either won an Oscar or been nominated for one, or a Grammy or a Tony. Anyway, Sammy came to him and my father closed his mouth and went over and said, I'm going to introduce you to Frank now. And he muscled through all these people and he said, Frank? And he said, yes, Sammy. He said, lovely party, Sammy. He said, thanks for inviting, not a problem. He said, I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine from England. He's the best talk show host they've got, one of the best in the world. He's even better than Johnny. He said, his name is Michael Parkinson. Here he is. And when you go over there, Frank, to England, please go on his show. It would make his day, but also you'll have a great time. And he went, do you know what, Sammy? If you say he's okay by me. And Frank Sinatra held out his hand to my father, who could barely speak. He was so overawed, and said, that's great. Next time in London, I'm on your show. And with that, Frank turned away and my father was dismissed. My father then went to the edge of the room and didn't know quite what to say to anybody. He didn't know anybody. He thought, well, I don't want to overstay my welcome. So what I'll do is I'll say goodbye to Sammy and I'll go and seal the deal by saying goodbye to Frank, my new best friend. And he went over to Mrs. Sinatra, who was standing there with his, the Rat Pack, Dino and Sammy and all that. And he got to see, he said, Mrs. Sinatra? He said, yes. Miss Sinatra turned to my father and said, yes. And he went, it's been a delight meeting you. It's one of the honors of my life. And I'm so, so happy that you've agreed to appear on my show and you're next in England. And Frank turned to his new best friend, my father, and said, that's not a problem, David. And so that was the end of my father's chance of speaking to Frank Sinatra, because he got the wrong person. So there we go. But he got that close. But he was the best. But there were many others, particularly in the kind of music side of it. I mean, there was a man called Louis Armstrong, the father of jazz, and he never forgave his best friend, David Frost, who knew absolutely nothing about jazz music, who interviewed Louis Armstrong at least twice. So that was it. But yes, Sinatra was one of his regrets. He didn't have many regrets, to be fair. Let's have another question. Oh, I'm here. So I should have had some glasses here. So wildlife documentary. Will you be interviewing any AI celebrities? Could we see AI interview AI Ali? Well, that's a very interesting concept, isn't it? I mean, the difficulty with creating an AI iteration of anybody is that you have to be really careful that you're not putting words in their mouth that they did not or would not have said. And what's interesting is that when I first thought about this idea, I went to a company called Deep Fusion, who are run by Ben Field and Jamie Anderson, and they're kind of at the forefront of this, certainly in the UK. And I came up with an idea that I didn't think about an interview series at all. I thought about my father curating his best archive, and using an AI iteration of him to essentially script him, to say, to link the clips. And Ben, who's really at the forefront of all this, the principles and the policies as towards AI and the use of it, with the way they're using it. And he said, do you know what? The problem with that is that we don't know that's what your father would have said. And we can't allow you, and I don't want to be part of something where we put something in your father's voice that we cannot be guaranteed that he said. And I thought, really? And he said, yeah, because Jamie Anderson, who's Jerry Anderson's son, they did a documentary together. And what Jamie had done with his father is that Jamie had some audio recordings of his father doing an interview, and they created an AI iteration of his father, but he was saying what his father would have said. So that's why we went down the interviewing route, because in a sense, what my AI father would be saying what would come out of research. So in a sense, we knew that effectively was something that we would feel comfortable that we would be saying. And also because I'm involved, I would make sure that he would say it in a way and interview something in that way. To have someone else would be extraordinary. To have another interview with Ali would be amazing. To go back to do John Lennon again. Sadly, John Lennon's interview was wiped by the BBC. We only have a grainy kind of image. To recreate that image, that interview again would be amazing. To do all the ones we've talked about, to go and do Sinatra would be amazing. The difficulty would be is how they would answer the questions, because we would have to work very closely with their estates. We would have to make sure that everyone was aligned. We would have to make sure there was some way that we could really guarantee that if my father asked them a question about their life, that they would answer in a way that was demonstrably true and demonstrably how they would answer. So there's an awful lot of barriers to get over. And I really do think if we can do it, I would love to do it, because I think it would be absolutely extraordinary. But I do think there are some quite difficulties in the way of doing that. But, watch this space. Who knows? So Theo Payne. Now, I know a Theo Payne. Theo Payne, I don't know if that could be Theo Payne. My son had a friend called Theo Payne. But anyway, very weird. Which celebrities had your dad interviewed would you like to have on the podcast? Oh, that your dad has interviewed. Let me think. Well, I would have loved to have had, sadly, she's no longer with us, Dame Edna Everage. Purely because I would love to have seen Dame Edna try to actually interact with an AI. It would have been absolute chaos, because there's no way that she would have accepted the fact that this AI was questioning her. She would have completely hijacked the entire process and probably would have done, in a way, probably would have scrambled the poor AI's brains by reacting in a way that it couldn't have coped with at all. That would have been fantastic to do. He has interviewed. He has so many. I suppose, and I keep talking about people that are no longer with us, but I think that, one of the ones, Billy would have been interesting to see how he would have reacted to it, because, of course, their relationship was based so much upon a close friendship and an interaction. And I wonder how Billy would have done to that. It's a difficult question. I'm going to may have to come back to that, because I can't quite think of anyone else that I necessarily do. And I think a lot of what I said in the last question kind of covers it. So this is Sarah. Why create the podcast? What's the reason for it? Why create the podcast? Well, there's kind of an obvious reason why I create the podcast. Because if I don't create it, then I think someone else will. I think that we are at a stage now where the AI issue, the genie is out of the bottle. And I think that we are now going to have to, as a industry, media industry, to embrace it in a sensible and a principled manner. And I think that this is a good way of me protecting my father's legacy by making sure that if there is going to be any AI iteration of him, that it's me who controls it in a way. But I actually also think that what fascinates me is that the way that AI interviews is very similar to my father. And bear with me on this, because what the AI does is it absorbs information, completely absorbs it. It reads everything you tell it to read, and it knows absolutely everything factually about the person that's in front of it. There's nothing that person in front of it could tell them about themselves that it wouldn't know, which is very like my father. The other thing is that it listens, and it listens with inverted commas. I've explained what it does. It transcribes, and that's what my father used to do. And what is very similar between them, which is why I found it a fascinating idea, was that my father used to create interview structures, and all they were was a list of questions which went from they described an arc. They went from beginning to the end, and we would discuss that. When I used to produce him, we used to discuss it, and he would say, "Fine, okay, that's where I want to go, but let's just see how it goes." And what he meant by "let's just see how it goes" is, what answers would he get? Because if the answers took him somewhere else, he wouldn't go back to the structure. He'd go with the answer. And that is what AI does. Now, AI is a little bit more dogged than my father. AI sometimes gets a bit kind of not lost, but sometimes goes after it, probably longer than it should sometimes. But if it gets an answer to a question and it picks up on something that is interesting, or a word or a phrase, AI will, like my father, essentially ignore its interview structure and start to follow that thread. And we have to, with actually, not we, but Ben, who sits actually with the AI, and it sounds kind of really technical. It's actually not. It's Ben in front of a laptop. That's where AI Parky is. And sometimes we have to prompt it. For instance, we had great interview yesterday with Jill. I forgot her name. Jill Scott. How can I forget Jill Scott's name? She was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But one of the people in the box before I made the point, we need to sort of just get a few areas about match of the day, or about the disparity between men and women payment, and that's all we had to do. AI Parky had done what it wanted to do. We just prompted a little question, and the question came in very naturally. So there is a very interesting comparison between my father. And finally, I think the reason why I want to do it is because, from my perspective, I am fascinated about how we are going to interface with AIs in the future, and how we are going to actually be able to communicate with them, and how they're going to communicate with us. And I think that we are attempting to discover how to make this a comfortable way of doing it, and also to try and discover a different way to people to tell stories, because the world we exist in is full of noise. It's a cacophonous place, and everyone is trying to outdo everyone else. Everyone is blaring at the same level. No one has a chance to sit back and go, this is what I really think. This is what I really feel. And what AI Parky does, and could do, and will do, is allow a very safe space for people to sit there and just say what they want to do, to tell their story without interruption, and at times without judgment. So there's a mixture between a celebration of my father, but also an exploration of a new frontier. Jerry Anderson, are you happy with the podcast so far? Well, yeah, I am actually. I have to say, what's interesting, I have to say, is that we were very brave. I think we didn't try to hide behind anything, because we didn't know what was going to happen when we sat Jason Derulo down in front of AI Parky. In fact, initially nothing happened because we got Jason there and Ben pressed the button. How AI Parky works is that to start him off, the guest has to say, "Hello, Michael," and then it reacts and it begins. And Jason said, "Hello, Michael," and nothing happened. And AI Parky wasn't playing ball at all. And Ben was incredibly relaxed about this. But then we discovered in that wonderful way that probably, all great technological advances, that someone hadn't plugged a lead in. Someone left a cable out. So we plugged that in and it began. Anyway, when it happened, we basically were very open. We did a producer's debrief afterwards where we were totally open about how we felt it good, what was good about it, what was bad about it. And we always been very clear from the moment we ever talked about this. This is an ongoing process. This is a process where we are trying to develop, trying to work. We are essentially, if you want to put it in kind of human terms, we have got a rookie interviewer who what we've done is have said to them, here is a textbook of a grandmaster. And we're going to allow you to use his voice and use his back catalogue. And but you then have to learn how to interview. And also you have to learn how to be with people that you don't really know how to be with. So we're going to have to teach you how to do it. So it's been a question of teaching it. And every single time that we've done a new thing, a new interview, something subtly has changed. And I have to tell you that the Jill Scott interview, it was a real breakthrough for me because I had my reservations. So did Ben. So did Jamie. And also, we have been open. We had the Guardian newspaper come in. We didn't hide. We said, look, write what you want. Monty Don was allowed to say what he wanted to say about it, and everyone has been allowed to say what they feel about it. But we know as producers that we are on a journey. And I don't like that word because it thinks I'm on some kind of reality television show. But we are on a journey. We're on a journey with AI Parky. We are trying to do something which is really at the edge of what is possible. And I think this Jill Scott interview is the real launch pad, because suddenly it felt so natural and felt so different. And if you look at Jill's reaction afterwards, that's very special, very interesting, very much so. I think I missed one actually. It said, going back, I think, can I go back up here? Was my dad fun to work with? Yes. Was my dad fun to work with? He was exacting to work with. It was fun working on the show, but my goodness, he was a taskmaster. He was a martinet. I mean, he was incredibly supportive. And we used to have some extraordinary ding-dongs. We did. I mean, we had a great relationship with father and son because we were able to leave our personal relationship at the door. And when we were professional, I dealt with him as the talent. He dealt with me as the producer. And we just have some remarkable ding-dongs. I mean, real proper falling outs about it, which is kind of part of the creative process, particularly two people who are quite headstrong. But my one thing about my father, and why he was fantastic to work for, is he always had your back. That was the point. If you went out there and you made a decision and maybe it didn't work, maybe it didn't work, maybe the interview didn't work, maybe something went wrong, he'd never throw you under the bus. He would stand up and go, it's my show. My name's on the title. Don't go after anyone else. Go after me. And that's what was brilliant about him. And the one thing also about my father, why he engendered such loyalty, there was a man called Bill Grundy. You probably won't. Some people might know this. He was a irascible reporter on Granada, and he was one of my father's early mentors. And he said to him, as a young performer, my father did a piece to camera, and he felt quite good with himself, and walked off the set, and a bit cocky. And he got a knock on the door in his dressing room, and Bill came in, and he said, "I wanted to tell you something, young man." He said, "Don't ever do that." He said, "What?" He said, "Don't ever walk off the television studio floor again." He said, "Without thanking every single person out there." He said, "Because they're the ones who make you look good. Don't think it's just you, just think it's them." So every single show, my father will go around and say, thank you to the cameraman, thank you to the sound man, thank you to the band. and he'd go into the control room where we used to sit and say thank you to everyone. Not thank you to me, but he would say thank you to everyone else. No, but he was, of course, it was fun, and also it was extraordinary privilege. I mean, you don't need to produce a man like my father. My father produces himself. All you have to do is make sure that the actual environment is such that he feels comfortable within it. And to watch him perform is extraordinary, and was an extraordinary privilege. And I really can't take much credit for it, but it was great fun to do it. Thank you so much for uploading all the clips, and such an impact on growing up. I now work in television. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting about being an impact on growing up. One of the last things I ever did with my father, we wrote a book together called My Sporting Life, and we went to Cheltenham Literary Festival, and they said, look, would you and your father do this? We used to do this show together where I would sit there and talk about his life and career. We'd have a natter and we'd play some clips. It was lovely fun. We did it in the Sydney Opera House. Fantastic. It was one of the wonderful experiences of my life, particularly because the night we did it in Sydney Opera House, we just stuffed the Wallabies at rugby in the World Cup. So that was fantastic. I announced the score when I went on, which probably wasn't a very good idea. But anyway, so we did the show in the pavilion at the Cheltenham. And there were about 2,000 people in there to come and see him. And I've never seen this. He wasn't feeling good. This was quite near the last couple of years of his life. He was applauded onto the stage, standing ovation, literally had to tell him to sit down, and he was applauded off the stage. And we went to do a book signing afterwards. And every single person, rather like you said, you know what, when I was a kid, I used to sit with my mum and dad, or sit with my auntie, or sit with my gran or my aunt. And he realized how much he had meant to them, not just as a performer, but something that was part of their family, part of their growing up. He represented something which kind of came through the television screens way beyond what he was doing as an interview show. There was something about him that connected with him on a deeper level. And I think that it's interesting how he did. And I think it was because he was a principled man, and he had full of integrity, which is why, as goes back to my last answer, he was wonderful to work for. What would Parky's advice be for anyone wanting to improve their interview skills? This is from the Michael Parkinson channel. Well, okay. Well, two things, really. Quite simple. Do your research. I mean, if you're interviewing someone that you know that you're interviewing, do your research. Get to the point where you know more about them than they know about themselves. So there's nothing that they can say to you that's going to surprise you. There's nothing worse than think, oh, crikey. It was a wonderful example of that, and we'll have it on. Hopefully we'll have it on when we get the BBC to unleash their collection of archives. A wonderful example of that with Barry Manilow. My father interviewed Barry Manilow. Barry Manilow had written an autobiography. He'd written an autobiography. And Barry my dad said, now, Barry, I was surprised to learn in your autobiography, which you wrote, that you were a bit of a brat when you were younger. And Barry went, well, yeah, I was, just a bit. I was a bit sometimes. He said, no, but you really were a brat. He said, you used to clear out restaurants beforehand, before you went in. He said, no, I never did that. He said, well, you did. He said, no, I never did that. He said, well, okay. Barry said, well, anyway, that's not true. Well, where'd you read that? My father said, it was in your autobiography. So there you go, Barry, hung by your own petard. So that's an important thing to do, because it means that you know when you go down a line of questioning that they can try and fudge it. But if you know the truth, and the other thing about interviewing, it's a simple thing, but no one does it. I don't do it. My father was a master at it. Listen. And don't just listen passively, listen, because you might pick up something. They might be saying something, because particularly people who've been interviewed a lot, they get into a way of talking. You ask them, they go on autopilot. But sometimes they'll say something. And if you're really listening, they think, okay, that's interesting. Because sometimes some of my dad's interviews were going nowhere. But someone would say something, and suddenly it would go in a completely different direction. There's a good example of that, actually. We were talking before this live thing on IT. Well, you should watch it if you can. Is the Bruce Willis interview? It's a very stilted interview at the start. Bruce was unsure, and then suddenly it went somewhere else. It started talking about love and marriage and all that, which which probably because he listens. So there's those two things. There's many others. I don't want to give away too many trade secrets. Okay, so Claire Webster, do you have any of the older interviews? The older celebrities were so much more interesting. Well, I'm not sure that's entirely fair. I think I think that, to be honest with you, I think the modern day celebrities have a huge amount of pressure on them. They can't be as open as the older celebrities because they've got social media, because they've got people who are waiting for them to say something and misinterpret them. So they have to be much more guarded. And also the interview scene has changed now. They're not allowed, tell me about yourself and your project in 5 minutes and also be funny. And then, whilst I'm trying to be funny, I'm trying to outdo you. So it's a very difficult experience. The older celebrities were, because they lived in a much more freer society, a much more freer time. And also, they didn't have to worry about what they said because they weren't going to get picked up on it. But there was I think my father would honestly say the generation that he did love interviewing, mainly because of his age, was in the 70s, in the 71 to 81, was that war generation, the ones that had been through the war. There was something fascinating about them, to him, something extraordinarily interesting and I don't know, not interesting is the wrong word. They just were they were kind of nation builders in a way. They transformed everything, and there was a great respect there. And the modern day celebrities, it's not their fault they didn't live through a war. So it's interesting. But we do want to definitely get the older celebrities on. But if you ask my father about his best interviews, everyone always goes, "Oh, it was the 70s were the best." He would say, no, not at all. He said some of my best interviews were in the 90s, and one of my favorite interviews is actually from the ITV series. So it's interesting. He felt he was a better interviewer as he got older, because we do all get better at things as we get older. So this is from Karen. Hello. I don't think perfection should be interfered with. One of the greatest, if not the greatest interviewers. All the originals can't have been. They're also wonderful memories. I agree with you. I'm not, in no way, shape, or form, is AI Parky attempting to interfere with the perfection of my father. Although, of course, I knew him as a man, so he was far from perfect, but he was very perfect as an interviewer. But no, we're not in any shape or form. What we're trying to do is what I've explained before, and we're also attempting to try and introduce my father's style and introduce my father's legacy to a newer generation who are probably much more au fait with AI. And it is definitely an age thing. It's definitely a thing that people probably of a certain generation who grew up with him, who love what he did, probably feel a little bit resistant to it. But, you must never feel that I would in any way besmirch his legacy by trying to recreate him. I'm not. I wouldn't want to do that. I mean, my memory of my father is too precious. My memory of my time working with my father is too precious. What we are doing with AI Parky, it's interesting what Jill Scott said. What made it a fascinating interaction was because of my father's voice, because it engendered in Jill a memory of someone that she trusted and someone that she remembered as being a great interviewer. And through that, she was beginning to interact with an AI, which in no way, shape, or form is like my father. Although he carries its name. Okay, so Karen, tech has its place and not in everything. No, you're right. Yeah, true. It hasn't, but unfortunately, we have to understand that tech will become in everything. What would be your dream guest? Dream guest? Oh, it's difficult to know what my dream guest would be, really. There are so many fascinating people. People always ask, it's an incredibly difficult question to answer that, because my father was asked that all the time, and he would just say it differently all the time. He would, because I tell you what a dream guest is, and I don't want to keep mentioning her, but it's someone like Jill Scott, it's someone like Chris McCausland, which we've done on the Virtually Parky podcast. It's people who basically have a capacity to tell their story in a very open and honest way, and that they are prepared, because an interview is a two-way street. If I ask you a question and you go yes or no, or don't know, then it's a pointless interview. But if you actually engage with it, it's a good interview. Now, I'm talking too much as you go down here. What would be your dream? Yes. Of all your father's interviews, which one is your favourite? My favourite is Noel Gallagher on ITV. It's a brilliant interview. You have to watch it when it's on. It is absolutely fantastic because Noel Gallagher does not know what's happening, and he doesn't realise that a man in front of him knows more about him than he knows. So I've got one here. Is there a chance that there will be influences on the AI, either from research? No, none at all. No influences at all. The research we produce for the AI is totally, utterly fact-based. We'd have no opinion. We do not give it an opinion. It is fact-based only, and we've made it very clear because we will not allow it to have an agenda. That's the point about it. It has no agenda at all. What are the most challenging issues you face with the podcast AI? People's perception, the idea that in somehow I'm trying to recreate my father. I'm not. And also the idea that somehow you're trying to compare it to a human interviewer. Yes, we want to make it more human-like, but it's not going to be a human interview. We want to create a different way to tell stories, different interview space. It was one of the best shows I've ever watched and still is. Thank you. What is your best memory with your father? My best memory with my father is actually walking out on stage at Sydney Opera House when we stuffed the Wallabies 40-0. It was absolutely fantastic. It was one of the best memories. One of my fave shows, loving the podcast as well. Thank you. That's very good. I'm glad you are. And I just hope everyone else is loving the podcast because I am. What do you hope to achieve with the podcast? As I said, I want people who didn't even father to find my father. Thank you, Michael, and totally get what you're saying. I agree about the voice too. It had the Morgan Freeman effect. It was very Morgan Freeman, absolutely. As a producer, what was your favorite interview your father did? Well, Noel Gallagher. And I'll tell you why Noel Gallagher, because he was completely resistant to it. When we were in the actual production meeting and I mentioned Noel Gallagher, he looked as if I basically put something rather unpleasant on the table. And he said, he's an idiot. He'd read what the Sun had written about him. And I said, do it because it's a very good interview, because he's actually very similar to you. He comes from a similar background. And he said, and the great line, he said, if it goes wrong, it's on your head. So we did the interview, and like all great performers, he turned around to me and said, you know what? What a great idea to have him on the show. I said, whose idea was it? He said, it was mine. So he claimed that for himself. But it's a fantastic interview. It really is, because it's just everything. It's funny, it's irreverent, and it's just insightful as well. And I think that's about it, I think. There's any other questions at all? No, thank you very much indeed. I hope I didn't talk too long. I probably did. And probably any questions that I didn't get to, very sorry. But hopefully we'll do some more of these. Please watch Virtually Parky. I mean, it is worth it. Please stick with it. It's only going to get better. Thank you very much indeed.